Good afternoon, everyone. We'll go ahead and get started. I'm Patrick Fiegelson, the Executive Director for the RISE Institute for Literacy. We are a nonprofit whose mission is to promote and ensure literacy by supplying research-based reading resources and interventions to pre-service teachers, struggling readers, including those with dyslexia, and provide support and resources to their parents. The focus of the next hour will be on 1, why children and adults can struggle reading. 2, what is the best instruction to ensure every child is a successful reader? And 3, what are the available resources for you and your child? We welcome you today and are excited for the information and instruction that we will receive today from our speaker, Chantel Barrett-Blake. Chantel works professionally as a developer in the English field and is a dyslexia expert and mother of a child with dyslexia. She has a bachelor's degree in English teaching, and an MA in education with a reading science concentration and a certification in dyslexia. RISE feels very fortunate to have Chantel with us today. And with that, I'll turn the time over to you, Chantel.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm excited to be here with you to share this information that was so valuable to me when I was looking for ways to help my own child, and also as an educator. So I come at this from both directions, and I'd actually like to know why you are here today, who you are here for. Is it for yourself? Is it for a child, another family member, a friend, and the age of the individual that you are that you have in mind today. So could you go ahead and put that in the chat? And the chat is a feature I'll use a couple of times today. You can find that at the bottom of your screen or the Q&A. If you could type it in there, you can ask questions throughout in either of those features, and we'll save time for questions at the end where you can even raise your hand and be unmuted if you want, or always put it in the chat. So if you could just add that into the chat so I can get a sense of who's here and why you're here today, that would be super helpful. Thank you, Janelle, for adding that. And Sue, thank you. 8. Okay. Good. Just going to give it a couple more minutes to get some more feedback. Your son, he's 9. Margarita, did I say that correctly? Margareta, Rita, you'll have to help me when we unmute in a little bit. Make sure I pronounce that correctly. Melinda, okay. This 20-year-old is ADHD and dyslexic. Okay. We're on to help a refugee boy who is 10. Okay. Okay. Thank you for sharing those reasons why you're here today. Kimberly, a second grade teacher and a mom of a 4th grader, has reading difficulties. Daughter 15, educator, several students struggle with literacy skills. My daughter and son are dyslexics. I work with for 2nd graders. My daughter is 15, my son is 10. Okay. Darlene, thank you. Perfect, thank you. Okay, so I'll keep looking at those for a little bit. That helps me understand your background into why you're here today. I wish we could be in person so that we could talk and converse as friends on this journey. I think sometimes we feel pretty alone on this journey about how to help and where to look. I remember very specifically as my son was struggling and I wasn't quite sure what was happening. We did for a while it was just unsure of what was going on, and then did find the diagnosis of dyslexia and dysgraphia, and just feeling really overwhelmed of what to do for him because I'd worked with him enough. He didn't qualify for services at school. And I remember very distinctly the night that I just put the kids to bed. This is when they were younger. He was about 7 at the time, and walked back down the stairs into the office and just started searching online, how to help a struggling reader or individuals with dyslexia, or how to help your child with dyslexia, everything I could think of. And just being really overwhelmed, everything saying it was the answer. I knew enough to know to look for Orton Gillingham, but not quite sure what that meant. And all the training looked really far away, and how was I going to access that? And coming across Reading Horizons at some point in my search and reading through that site, went to the site and just feeling like there's a little something different here, and there's an element of simplicity, and that's the program that Rise uses. There was an element of that that just resonated. Plus, having an online software piece, because working with your own child can be really challenging. Emotions are really high. There's a lot that goes on there. So having something as kind of a buffer was another valuable piece. And I loved it so much that when I went into, I decided I wanted to certify in it. So a couple of you had mentioned tutoring and teaching. And remember sitting in that training thinking, oh my goodness, this is what I was missing. This is what I was missing as an educator when I didn't understand when my junior high and high school students were still struggling. This is what my child needs, and just wanting to be able to share that information with other parents and other teachers, because I remember feeling so overwhelmed in that search. And if I can help eliminate some of that overwhelm and guide you in a direction that can be helpful, that's part of why I'm here today. So those objectives, Pat already mentioned, so that I'm going to cover today. We'll talk a little bit about why children and adults can struggle with reading and the most effective instruction to make sure everyone's a successful reader. And then we'll share some of those available resources for you and your child at the end today. So let's start with why reading struggles are such an issue and the percentages that are so high, what's happening there. So I want you to start by thinking about, I shared a little bit about my story as far as coming to find this approach, but my own personal story about reading, and that's what I want you to think about for a minute. I loved reading. I couldn't get enough of it. I remember, I loved like the Beverly Cleary books. And my favorite thing in the summertime was right after the lawn had been mowed and it had that fresh smell to take a blanket out and go read a book. That's some of my fondest memories in the summer. And I had all of these visions of sharing that with my children too. And realizing that was going to be very different for my son and his younger sister that's a compensator that came a little bit later. So just think a little bit about what your experience was like with reading. Did you love it? Did you struggle? What did that look like? And if you want, you can share that out in the chat, but you don't need to. But I just want you to think about that story for a minute, what your relationship is like with reading. And sometimes as a parent or an educator, if we had a difficult relationship with reading, then that can affect, our anxiety even more so for our children or those that we're trying to help. Now I'm going to ask you one more question about that. Do you remember how you learned to read? How did you learn to read? I think about that. I remember reading some of those early books, those primer books, but I don't remember specifically how I learned to read. And anytime I've asked individuals, including educators, how they learn to read, we all kind of have the same, I don't know for sure. And we maybe remember a few rules we were taught along the way, but that process is usually pretty ambiguous for us. And that's because we usually don't have a very explicit instruction in reading, which kind of lent to why we believe it's more of a natural process, which is actually not a true statement. Sharon shared that she remembers reading Dick and Jane, but that's about all she remembers about how I learned to read. I always loved to read and learn with Dick and Jane. Yeah, yep. Yeah, all of us might share a little bit of that similar story in our paths as well. So yeah, again, we remember reading possibly, but not how that process happened. There are particular parts of our brain that are designed to read or wired for reading. Now, reading or primed to make those connections for reading, because our brain is actually not wired for reading. It's wired for speech, but it has to be bolted on and those connections have to be made for reading. And so often that misconception that reading would just happen naturally. For a lot of us, we can, if we're accessing the language centers, have it seemingly come on naturally, but we're still not understanding the why or the code behind English, and those things can then be detrimental. Thanks, Lynn, for sharing that on your personal, as to what that was like for you. Okay, so now I'm going to talk a little bit more about our story, particularly my son's story. So, I mentioned a little bit of it. He I mean, I loved reading. I loved English. That's why I went into what I did as an educator. I believe in the power of words and the ability to access text to change our understanding, to expand our perspective. I loved all of that. I think it's, such an empowering aspect of this human experience, and I wanted to share that, which is why I went into that in education. And I wanted to share that with my children. And my son, so I have 3 kids. Amanda, Tyler, that you're seeing here, and then Brielle, and they're all older now. But when they were younger, cool, Denise, thank you for that. When they were younger, I did the same things with all of them. We went to story time at the library. We did preschool. I did all the preparation, and my oldest came out soaring. She was reading Harry Potter in kindergarten. It was insane. She just loved it. Okay, thanks, Shelley. So she just loved it. My son did the same thing, very different results. He would be reading a word one line, same word would appear just a few lines later, act like he'd never seen it before. Start to sound out a word, take his eyes off the page, just guess or skip it altogether. Then sometimes he'd be reading along and get this bigger word that I was like, holy cow, how'd you do that? And then he'd miss it or is. There was just this disconnect as to what was happening, and I didn't understand enough about the reading process to really fully grasp what was happening with him. A few of you had mentioned that your children have been diagnosed with dyslexia and ADHD or ADD. Those are very often what we call comorbid issues, where one usually is paired with the other. So actually, one of the first things that we thought was happening with him in preschool was ADD, and he was diagnosed with that. The attention, though, was very particular to language. And so as you think about where those attention issues are, but it's one of the research that Dr. Sally and Bennett Shaywitz have been working on, is that correlation between ADD and dyslexia. So this is an interesting picture. This was such an interesting, not planned picture, is to kind of talk a little bit about what was going on with him. So what's interesting, and Dr. Sally Shaywitz talks about it in her original book, Overcoming Dyslexia, where it's like for these students who do not access the same language centers in the brain, it's like they need glasses and they're staring at a brick wall, and they can say, yep, that's a red wall. And then we give them glasses and they go, oh, that's made out of individual bricks. It's like the first time they start to identify that these words are made out of individual parts and how those build together. And so that was interesting, that this picture, we were actually at Legoland. I don't know why he looks depressed, because we had a really good time. But it's just such an interesting photo that the 2 things that speak most about my son are in this one picture. Lego brain. They'll talk about him all that time. That'll be related in this high spatial child that we'll see, where they process information. It's dominated by visualization as opposed through the language. And he could see how he'd want to build something from Legos, and he would start from the big picture and bring it in. He was just very much a whole to part, high spatial awareness, and not so much language based. He could not see those parts and pieces and how those worked together for him. So Richard Selznick talks about it in his book, The Shutdown Learner, that these shutdown learners tend to be, that's the issue, is that they're high spatial kids. So, they're the Lego kid, they love puzzles, they engage for hours with hands-on activities. That's what always baffled me when he was identified with ADD, is I'm like, okay, he has some serious attention span on certain tasks, right? He likes taking things apart to see how they work. Oh my gosh, my kid, if I didn't watch him, he'd have all the toys torn apart and then putting them back together. He enjoyed hooking things up, good awareness of visual detail. He could see where the problem was, an excellent visual recall. But the language-based was his weakness. He did not have a good understanding of words and word usage. He couldn't process information very quickly. That affected his communication skills socially as well. And he did not enjoy reading or writing, and still some of that is a really big challenge for him. So it's interesting, a lot of times our students who struggle with the language-based characteristics, they tend to be those high spatial kids, and that's their strength, right? But the reason they shut down, why he talked about it and titled his book The Shutdown Learner, is because in education, it is primarily focused for language-based. And so if you've got students in this environment who are not language-based, they're more high spatial, then it's just really problematic, and they can tend to shut down very, very quickly. So let's talk about specifically, though, we're talking about where those language issues are. It's a very specific part of the reading process. So from all of the evidence that's been out there on how reading works, there was a model proposed that is really fantastic, super simple to identify what's actually involved in the process of reading. So our goal is reading comprehension, to understand what we're reading. Goff and Tumner back in 1986 proposed that reading comprehension is actually a product of two main components: decoding and language comprehension. So decoding is the ability to see those parts and pieces, to take the print off of the page and be able to determine that pronunciation and attach it to the meaning, that language comprehension. But a lot of times I'll get asked, well, it's just comprehension issue. That's where we need to focus with my students or with my child. And then I'll ask, okay, well, talk to me about that. Well, their reading is choppy. They don't like reading. They're not doing very good at remembering what they read. And I'll say, okay, if you read the passage to them, how do they do? Oh, well, then they're great. Well, then it's not a language comprehension issue at all, right? It's a decoding issue. And the reason it's so important, this formula, the way that it works, is this: one does not compensate for the other. They both have to be whole on their own for reading comprehension to be matched where the student needs it to be. So even if their language comprehension is at a 1, which is what we're looking for in research, and they have no decoding or even a few decoding skills, that's going to negatively affect their reading comprehension. And this, for most students, is where the issue lies within their reading difficulties. So what was interesting is, with that model that Goff and Tumner proposed back in 1986, they also identified 3 main types of reading difficulties. A 4th has since been added. Kilpatrick talks about that, and I'll mention that. So we're going to talk about these types of reading difficulties and then our typical reader. So we're going to take those 2 main components of the simple view of reading. We're going to put language comprehension on the top, and on the side here we're going to put word reading. And we're going to put both strong and weak in those fields and see where those match up. So our typical reader is actually strong in both. They're strong in word reading, or that decoding, and they're strong in the language comprehension. Now, individuals with dyslexia, it's very, very specific. Individuals with dyslexia, the weakness is just in word reading. Their language comprehension skills are actually very high, usually above average, which is why we can get the 4th type that Kilpatrick talks about, the compensator. So dyslexia is highly hereditary. And so it's usually, you'll see that within families. And I assumed it was only him because his younger sister even seemed fine until about junior high school, when the workload became so much that she started showing some of those deficits. She had been able to compensate because her language comprehension was so high, it was masking that weakness in word reading, and she was identified as mild a little bit later. Now, the mixed reading difficulty is a weakness in both. So they're weak in both word reading and in language comprehension. The 4th type is the most rare, but we do see it. It's the hyperlexic, where their weakness is actually just in the comprehension. Their word reading seems strong, their ability to decode. A lot of times they're called word callers. They just can't comprehend. So if you look at this and think about what you're seeing, a lot of you identified you're here for an individual with dyslexia. Maybe you're seeing mixed reading difficulty in your child or in your students, and maybe the hyperlexic, but it's more rare. But what's interesting about this is that 3 of those 4 most common types of reading difficulties, the deficit is in word reading. It's in a very specific part of the reading process, of that reading formula. And so often the irony is that most of our instruction in school is focused on here. And we just sort of maybe do 10 to 15 minutes of that phonics because it kind of got a bad rap, hence the ushering in of the whole language. So honestly, why students and adults can struggle? Because of lack of instruction in those skills. Again, we have to be taught those to be really, really automatic at those skills. But a main reason too is because 3 out of the 4 main types of reading difficulties, there is an identified difficulty or deficit within that word reading part of the comprehension formula. So as I mentioned, it was very specific. It was at that word level for Tyler. He'd recognize a word 1 line, same word would appear just a few lines later, act like he'd never seen it before, start to sound out a word, take his eyes off the page, just guess or skip it altogether. And he'd get larger words, but he'd miss those simple words like it or the. So I want to play a little bit about, so a few years ago, when Tyler was 17, he came in and we actually interviewed him about what it was like for him to have dyslexia, and know that I'm going to be speaking in general for any type of reading difficulty that's related to that decoding specifically part of the formula. That will be our focus. So if you have individuals that you're thinking of that maybe have not been identified, this is still important information for what they're going to need. There's lots of reading difficulties that, again, have this main component as the issue. But definitely we know it's not just a number game, but how it affects them personally. So he came in and shared a little bit about this. I had no idea what his responses were going to be. So I'm going to have him speak a couple of times to us today about what it is like for him.
Dyslexia, what it is to me is that I just have a hard time reading and writing and then trying to take notes and understand and process what my teachers say. Like sometimes I have a hard time saying it, so sometimes they think it's like made up or something. And so they think I just make an excuse for not being good at English or like writing, just my writing's really bad or my just reading and grammar and stuff. And they think I just make up an excuse, and it's not an excuse, and it's really something wrong with me. Sometimes when we're taking notes in class, it feels like we're like out catching butterflies, and it takes me forever just to catch one butterfly, and then the whole other class have caught like 3 butterflies, and I have to hurry up and catch up and take my time to catch 2 other butterflies, and it's just hard because it took me forever to get the first one. And like when colleges look at my grades, I always feel bad, like I'm not gonna get into a good college because of my grade in English, no matter how hard I try. I try to bring it up, but it's so hard to do it, and most teachers don't help me try to bring it up. I just get made fun of a lot because of it, because most people think it's just that I'm like stupid or something, but I'm not, and I just have a hard time with it. I just struggle in it.
Okay, so that was interesting, that analogy of the butterflies. I don't know where that came from that kid. Again, that visual where he has some great analogies, that it's like everybody else has already, caught 3 of those, and he's just caught 1 and he has to catch up. It was always this perpetual need to catch up, and that's an element of frustration that he dealt with a lot. And yeah, I mean, he prepped him and worked to take the ACT like 4 or 5 times to try to get that reading score up to where he wanted to get into college. But he ended up changing and focusing on his strengths, and he just finished programming school in January, and he's just brilliant at it. And so it's one of those things where finding their strengths and understanding that can be valuable, because they do process differently, and that experience is very specific to reading. In that specific aspect, and it is the way the brain is wired. So there are aspects of or very specific places in the brain where language is primarily housed. So the left hemisphere, which is the hemisphere that really processes information part to whole, and it processes sequentially, that's where most of us are accessing for the reading process. So we've got Broca's area, that verbal vocabulary in the frontal area, and then back here in the visual cortex, we have where we're seeing those parts and pieces and attaching meaning. We're able to analyze those parts of words because the left hemisphere does process part to whole. So that's where the idea of, maybe there's an element of natural readers. So again, it might seem that way simply because we're accessing those language centers. This was a study done by Dr. Sally and Bennett Shaywitz at Yale University, where they took 61 individuals, 29 had been pre-diagnosed as having dyslexia, did a functioning MRI, looking at the parts of the brain that were activated during the reading process. This is a very simple image of that. There were more connections and things happening, but it helps draw attention to the key pieces that are involved here. Those individuals with dyslexia, this is what their left hemisphere looked like. Nothing going on in the visual cortex, overutilizing Broca's area and accessing some of the right hemisphere to compensate for the lack of access here. So again, the right side processes very differently. It processes whole to part, and it processes spatially. And so that's why my son could recognize the word one line, but the same word would appear a few lines later, act like he'd never seen it before. Because his ability to recall that word wasn't about recognizing the word itself. A lot of times, what triggered the recall of that word was something spatially. Words around it, proximity to picture. It's why he could get a more phonetically complex word like house, because he wasn't looking at it from the phonetic end. He'd memorized house, and he could conceptualize and picture or visualize house. But how do you visualize it or that? And so that's why also, if they're starting to sound out a word, they're taking if they don't have that word memorized as an entire neural imprint, they're taking their eyes off the page. I remember him looking up and my other students looking up, and I'm like, what are you looking at? The word's right here. They're literally going up into that verbal vocabulary to try to find a word with similar sounds that might fit there, or meaning that fits there. Those are all red flags that he's not accessing these areas for the reading task. It's like having to take the bumpy back roads instead of the freeway. He'll get there, but it's going to take a whole lot longer and be really a lot more work for him when he gets there. So one of the key takeaways about that study by Dr. Sally and Bennett Shaywitz is this. What they identified is that it is not tied to intelligence, not at all. It is the way the brain is wired. It's neurobiological in origin, the way the brain is mapped out in the womb, and it is not tied to intelligence. Why is that information, do you think, important to the story? I want to know why you think that information might be important to the story for these individuals, children, adults, to know that it has nothing to do with their intelligence or ability. Go ahead and type in the chat why you think that might be important to the story or to what we know in this. Perfect, Sue. Proves it's innate, not due to laziness or bad teaching. Yeah, that was something that he was identified with a junior high teacher, that he was just lazy, and that wasn't the case. So they won't feel like they're somehow less than others. Absolutely. Yeah, Catherine, our school system puts so much emphasis on reading that when children struggle with it, they feel or are seen as dumb. My son comes home from school and says he's stupid. I tell him that God doesn't create stupid people. My son has had numerous teachers just say, try harder. Yeah. This is important, right? Because their belief, their self-perception, yeah, Rebecca, it gives them a place to work from. Their self-perception is the greatest indicator of success. Our self-efficacy, oh, Sharon, put a pin in that. I'm going to get to growth mindset in a minute. You just foreshadowed what we're going to talk about. Fantastic. That there's no limits, that we can keep growing. Yeah, it helps us be able to entertain the idea that we can have a growth mindset, that it's not something innately wrong with us, right? That everything is possible. It's very dependent. Yeah, good, Sue, that's awesome. So yeah, it's about helping them understand, and that self-perception is the greatest thing that we can help them shape, is that it is within their ability to be successful, to utilize their strengths, but also that they can develop these language-based skills. They can, but it's entirely dependent on the type of instruction they get. They can't just have any instruction. For our students who struggle, because we know those specific areas, we have to give them a very, very specific type of instruction. But again, this is such a critical piece of the puzzle. That phonemic awareness, that awareness of sound, that ability to connect that to those letters is the greatest indicator of reading success, not intelligence. This is my son's favorite quote. He loves Albert Einstein. And I love this quote. Everybody is a genius, but if you judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, it will live its whole life believing that it's stupid. Right? It's about that perception, and that this is so, discouraging and feeling dumb, when it's just we're not even looking at their strengths, and the school system is not always set up to help access those for our children, for our students. One of the things that is so fascinating to me is that connection between belief, that self-efficacy, and success. And this is one of my favorite. Guthrie is a big researcher on the correlation between motivation and reading outcomes. I studied him for my thesis a lot. And I love this quote: belief in yourself is more closely linked to achievement than any other motivation throughout school. The reason is that confidence, which refers to belief in your capacity, is tied intimately to success. So one of the biggest things that we have as tools to help change this for our students, for our individuals, for our children, is to help them change that self-perception. One of the ways that we can do that is by giving them the instruction that they need so they can see that it's possible to be successful, that they don't have to continue to struggle, that there is a very specific type of instruction that will yield the results that, that they're hoping for, and that is something that we can provide. So the science of reading is this vast body of evidence from multiple disciplines over decades, looking at the most effective type of reading instruction to give students the advantage in reading or to be successful readers. We have the evidence. We actually have for years. Somehow there's been this disconnect between the evidence and getting to the classroom, and even further getting to parents about what we need to do to help our children and ourselves or those around us be successful readers. We know the evidence is very clear on what type of instruction that we need. Back in 2000, the National Reading Panel came out and identified the 5 main components of what needs to happen for effective reading instruction. So every reading organization was able to jump on that bandwagon. Yep, we need to have all of these. What was not agreed upon was how these foundational skills should be taught and the amount of time those should be taught, the way that those should be addressed. So we sort of put some phonics back in, which is what we see a lot in K3, in basals or balanced literacy or guided reading, where we have some element of that. It's more of a word study approach, but it's not based on evidence, that it's not systematic, it's not explicit, it's not sequential. It's got to be a very specific type of approach where it's not analytic phonics, we're looking specifically at in a way that we are teaching those skills. And particularly because that's the issue, right? For our individuals with dyslexia and other language processing issues, that decoding is the issue. And so the way that those gets taught is beneficial for every student, but it is vital for our students with language difficulties or those reading difficulties. These benefit, so structured literacy is an approach that I'm going to talk about as to how you need to ask if the instruction is happening at the schools based, is it structured literacy? Or you can look at, what you're utilizing at home. Is it structured literacy? Is it based on the science of reading? Because while it benefits most students, it is vital for individuals with processing disorders and difficulties. So what structured literacy is, it's actually an umbrella term that was coined by the International Dyslexia Association, but it's just best practices, evidence-based programs and instruction based on evidence that's aligned to the science of reading. It really is focused on those word identification and decoding skills, because that is where, remember, 3 of the 4 main types of reading difficulties, that's where the deficit is. So they got very clear about not only what we should be teaching, but how we should be teaching it. And that developed into this graphic that they brought out that really helps us see that. So the inner circle are the elements, what we should be teaching. The outer circle are the principles, how we should be teaching it. And I'm going to walk through a little bit about what that looks like. And the great thing is that RISE is offering additional webinars coming up. It's going to help break a lot of this down to bite size and help us really know how to dive in and get that. One of the things that I love about this and what RISE does is it helps take, remember I said that gap was really far between evidence and classroom, it's even further from parents, and RISE is helping to bridge that and to bring the evidence and the resources that as parents we can use with our children. So let's talk about those elements. So phonology. So phonology is that awareness of sound. It's an awareness of, what's interesting is what makes speaking so easy makes reading so difficult. If I were to say the word cat, it comes as one burst of sound, or it sounds like cat. But in order to read and write, I have to be aware that cat is actually made up of 3 individual phonemes or smallest units of sound. I have to understand that it's made up of k, a, t. And then further, I have to understand that those phonemes are represented by graphemes. Those sounds are represented by letters. And then I need to be able to map those and then put them together to blend. So there's a lot going on there. That's why it still baffles me that we think that just hand a kid a book and they're going to get it, right? There's a very systematic, there's a lot that has to go into the reading process. And if we can help facilitate that, then that's going to be an easier process for our children and adults. So there are 44 sounds in the English language. We're focusing on the main 42, the later 2, the nasal ng and the voice zh, we bring in later into instruction. So whatever you're utilizing, make sure that there's a focus on the sounds that are produced, because we have to start with that. What is the awareness of those sounds? And having a program that you're utilizing that has an online component will add another depth of opportunity to be able to access and practice that. With an online component where they can hear and see the manner and placement of all of those sounds, see a mouth produce that sound and be able to record themselves and play it back. All of those activities can be really helpful, especially if they've got auditory processing issues. That can be really beneficial. One of you mentioned EL students that you're helping. I mean, it's a challenge just as an EL student if they're readers in their native tongue, but you mentioned they're not. And that creates a whole nother level of difficulty where if they're not literate in their native tongue, then we're just starting at ground zero. And so we're dealing with the language comprehension issue and the decoding. And so there's a lot that goes into that. But it's possible. It's still absolutely possible. We just want to make sure that that focus is starting here and building throughout. So the other elements that we should be teaching are sound symbol association. So mapping those letters and letter combinations to those sounds that are produced, and then syllables. Syllables are a key part of English language, for those parts of words that contain a vowel sound. And how we do that's going to be incredibly important. So even though there's a level of complexity to the English language, it doesn't have to be taught in a complex way. I remember I had a linguistics class in my undergrad as an English teacher, and thinking, oh my goodness, this is so confusing. I hope I never have to teach it. And leaving more confused than I started. And so until I went through this, I was like, oh, there really is this systematic, streamlined approach that I could do. This makes so much sense to me now. And that's a key factor. I think a lot of times why we don't find it in the classroom for our children is teachers aren't trained on it, and it feels overwhelming on what to do. So also part of our mission is to help make sure teachers are aware and empowered by understanding how to do this. And parents, of course, in this setting, that's our main mission with RISE, is to make sure that that happens. So we want it simple, but still comprehensive, covering everything. So covering in connection with those 42 sounds, just 7 core skills to prove the vowel sounds within words and our most common syllable types, building from that letter all the way to multisyllabic words very systematically and intentionally. Structured literacy is very explicit and systematic. That's part of those principles. So you want to be watching for that system and looking for how systematic is it and does it make sense? And yes, we will share the presentation with you after. So you're going to get a recording of this. And if you would like me to download this as a PDF, I can do that as well. So we are utilizing a marking system. The marking system, so remember my son in the brick wall, the inability to see that it's made up of individual bricks? That's what a good marking system does, is it helps them see, oh, there's the pattern. There's the individual brick. That's what I need to pay attention to. It's not just one big red wall. It's not just a word. It's about really utilizing and understanding those key patterns in the English language to make them successful, to be able to see those parts and patterns. So let's talk a little bit about some effective approaches to that instruction, what that looks like, so that you've got a benchmark to know what to look for. So with letter instruction, you want that very explicit and very systematic. Research has shown that there's not a lot of evidence as to one order being better than another in when we teach letters, but there is hard evidence on the most effective way to teach them is to teach the name and the sound of the letter at the same time. So for example, if I was teaching vowel A to start, I would say the name of the letter is A, the sound of the letter is A. And a kinesthetic cue to show what that sound is doing, like pretending I'm holding an apple, putting it under my chin and saying A, is incredibly effective for recall for students. It creates that visual connection as well. Teaching uppercase and lowercase formations simultaneously, and then a very intentional focus on blending sounds, which is really problematic for our students who struggle, for our children who struggle. We want to make sure that we're doing that very intentionally. Part of why you want to look at this is you don't want a program that's just teaching letters for a really long time without blending them. We teach in letter groups at RISE, where we're teaching 4 consonants with the vowel sound right away for that blending, which is such an important part of what we're doing. This is the order that we're teaching the letters in. You'll notice this is the order that we teach the vowels. We're not teaching A, E, I, O, U. The 2 most common vowels that are most easily confused are et and I, those short sounds, so we separate those in instructional time. Little things like that when we're mindful about the sequence or when and how we're teaching those, being very intentional to avoid confusion for students can make all the difference. C and K we're saving for a very important spelling rule that I'll show you in just a minute. But again, that phonological blending is a huge issue for individuals who struggle. And so we want to make sure that we're very, very intentional about what we're doing. So we're going to combine that consonant and a vowel, because that blending, what we call co-articulation, can be really problematic for individuals. So we want to combine those. We're going to make sure that they know that's not a word, though. We're going to put an arrow underneath to indicate that. It's not a word. They're going to go in the direction left to right, and that there is more coming, and it's going to come after that. So we would read that ba, so they're not going but we're working on that blending. And then we would build the word bag, identifying that slide, rolling on the ending sound. Once we build a word, that slide arrow is going to go away, and we're going to intentionally identify the vowel in the word by placing an X beneath it, because that's the critical factor. In English, to be a word, you have to have a vowel. Every word has to have a vowel, and every syllable has to have a working vowel or vowel sound. So this is also going to lay the foundation for syllabication. How many X's I have is how many syllables the word is. Super easy. So one X, one syllable, they can make that connection super powerful. Now we do want to use nonsense words with our children who struggle, because they need to be able to, we need to make sure that they understand the pattern and they're not just going back to their compensation strategies of whole word memorization. So that asterisk is used as a visual cue. This is not a real word, but because it's following the pattern of a word, we're going to go ahead and mark that vowel. That's critical. Any nonsense words would still have to follow the patterns or those rules within English. Now, anytime we're using a real word, we want to tie the meaning to it. We want to attach meaning to it. So any word you're talking about with your child or working on, use it in a context sentence. Using in a context sentence is even more effective than just talking about the meaning, but then you would talk about the meaning too if they don't know that word. So again, when we're talking about, this is called the 4-part processing model of word recognition, these processing systems that are involved in that. So you've got the phonological processor, the sound, the orthographic, that memory for letters, and phonics is really what's connecting those, which is why it's so important. But we want to make sure we're not leaving off meaning. When we're teaching the sound and spelling of a word, we want to be attaching meaning every time, because that's such a critical part of what we're doing as we go into context and making that connection. Semantics is one of the things that is covered in structured literacy, so we want to make sure that that is connected so the students know the meaning of a word, a phrase, a sentence, and text. So this is the order again that we're teaching. C and K saved way until the end for a very important spelling rule. And I love asking this. I was blown away when I went through the training on this the first time. That as an English teacher, I had no idea of this. As to why, for example, this is that 4-part processing system in action. You know, why, you know, we may know that this is a cup, but to be able to recognize cup and coffee in text, we have to know how to spell cup, and that we're going to use C and not K. We've got to make sure that we're teaching that spelling at the same time and putting it in context. So why do we use C and not K? How do we know to use C or K? Has to do with the vowel that follows. Look at the vowels that follow C and K when they're making the hard k sound. And here's a hard and fast rule. K takes the vowels I and E, and C takes the other 3, A, O, and U, every time for that hard k sound. If you know that, cool. You've probably trained in something like this. Kudos. If you didn't, totally fine, because most of us don't. We might know that the I or an E after the C would go soft, but very seldom did any of us get taught the other side of this rule, so we don't know it to turn around and teach our kids because we didn't learn it that way. That goes back to, I have no idea how I learned to read, right? And if I'd learned this, wow, what a game changer that would be in my spelling especially. So then you want to move very systematically from that direct letter to sound correspondence into concepts like blends. Blends are very important. We see those, they're in so many words, and they're going to affect where they divide multisyllabic words. So learning those blends systematically are going to be important. Digraphs, 2 consonants that make one sound, some combinations that are altering that vowel sound. Systematically building and teaching those very intentionally. Blends, for example, you want to have a very systematic approach. We don't want to have them read the blends alone, like GL, goal. I'm not glad to be here with you today, right? I'm glad to be here with you. So we would name those blends, those 6 L blends, 7 R blends, 8 2-letter S blends. But to pronounce them or blend them, we want to read them by blending them with that vowel sound, gla, and then building to the word glad. Blends are arced because they have a few unique characteristics. They must always be able to begin a word, and they are going to move together in syllabication. So we want them to identify that blend and then the vowel. And that's helping the brain start to recognize that pattern and what to pay attention to. That's so important for our individuals who are struggling. So when we talk about, I've started to go into the phonology and sound symbol. We're going to get a little bit more into syllables. I talked some about semantics. I want to talk about these principles, how we're teaching it. So one of the most effective ways to teach is that instructional design of the gradual release of responsibility, the I do, we do, you do approach. So because a structural literacy approach is cumulative, you don't want to move on with your child until you know they've got those previous skills, because they're going to build upon that. So you always want to start with a review, just about 5 minutes. It's more of an informal assessment. So it's not like really a normal paper pencil test. It's just watching them practice. Do they have that skill? Can they explain it back to you? Good. Then we can go into the instruction of the new. Then we go into guided practice, where we want a multi-sensory piece. We are also Orton Gillingham based, so that brings in the multi-sensory component and a very structured lesson. And then transfer, always transferring to reading, 5 minutes to start, additional reading, and the word writing is missing. It should say reading and writing. We want to add more time there for that transfer. The dictation process, this is one of the most important things we do. This connects all of the language centers in the left hemisphere, all the sensory input and motor output involved in language. They're going to hear it, see it, write it, and read it. And you can do this at home. You can get anything for a whiteboard, but you want to be utilizing this with your child, because this will be the fastest way to make those connections. So I'm going to show you this process, and then we'll talk about it.
We are going to do another 3-letter slide, and this 3-letter slide is GRI, GRI. Your turn. GRI, GRI. Say it if you need it. Check my board when you are finished. Use your resources, use your posters, say it. Show me ready, position, ready. Our word is drop, drop. Your turn? Drop. Drop. Very good. This one is independent. You will not be checking from my board. You're writing on your own. And circle and fix. Next one is grip, grip. Your turn? Grip. Grip. I will grip the handlebar on my bike to ride it. Grip.
Okay, so what did you notice in that process? What stood out to you? Go ahead and drop it in the chat. What did you notice about that? So they just learned those blends. They're working on the R blends. What about the process? Kids were standing and moving. Great. Yes, that was a really great piece for engagement, which is the facilitator to learning. Anything else stand out to anybody? So in that process, the teacher's saying it 2 times, the students are taking it back 2 times, they're writing it and marking it, and then they're reading it. They didn't read that. Arm movements, arm movements, they're tossing it to them. The students are actually taking it to their ears, so they're listening, and then they're giving it back. The reason the teachers or the parent would point to their mouth is to give any cues about that pronunciation. Students are listening and then giving it back. I did that in tutoring one-on-one. I did that with my child because it is so critical. And I'll be honest, at first it felt a little funny one-on-one. And so I kind of was like, oh, just write this word and mark it. And then the more that I learned about how critical that process was to connect what is known as the orthographic and phonological loops involved, from a sensory input to a motor output to a sensory input, that changed everything for me. That is not something I skipped in my tutoring or work with my child anymore. That's a critical factor in making those connections in the language centers of the brain. So in that process, students and those individuals are hearing it, saying it, writing it, and reading it. They're starting auditory, ending visual. We want to reverse that process and go visual to auditory. And so this is where right after that, you want to see whatever skill you're working on in print, being able to name it, practice blending with the vowel sounds to words that are based on that skill, and sentences based on that skill. That practice is going to build that fluency. It's going to build confidence because they're going to be successful because it's completely decodable based on what they've learned. It should be accessible to them. If not, we need to go back and reteach and practice. But that builds that success, that confidence, which goes to building that self-efficacy, which also starts to change that self-perception. Then that final step should always be to connect a text. Then they should be reading a full text. But so often what happens is we give them just a regular book. Oh, well, this is at your level, read that. Decodable text has a different purpose. Decodable text is based on that 95 to 100% of the words that they've seen in there, they've learned those patterns. So they should be able to be successful with it. Again, that builds confidence, and we know from the evidence that that helps make those connections in the brain. So decodable text is the middle step that needs to happen before we go to just level text or text at their level, their reading level. So decodable text is really, really important in what we're doing for that transfer. From there, we go from just marking words to proving words. We want to help our children be metacognitive, to start to think about why is this vowel short? Why is it long? Why is this word pronounced this way? Why is it spelled this way? If they can understand at that level, that's a game changer. They are unstoppable. It's not about rule memorization. Yes, there's an element of that pattern recognition, but it's understanding the why behind that translates further. So they learn these 5 phonetic skills to prove whether the vowel will be short or long within a word or syllable. And how we do that is by the spatial process to prove. Remember I said spatial, high spatial is a strength. So this is going to be incredibly helpful for our children who struggle. So they mark everything underneath the word left to right. That helps them understand to track the word left to right. They're going to come up and around the end of the word and look at what follows the vowel to prove the vowel sound. So if you watch my mouse, it's like I'm making a road or a racetrack around that word. If they stay on that road, that will tell them where to go next. They don't have to remember a list of steps, okay? And the reason we come up and around the end of the word is because it's what follows our vowels to determine their pronunciation. So when we come up and around the end of this word and we've got one consonant and nothing else following that vowel, we call that a guardian consonant. That guardian star is the visual to indicate its job or action. A guardian in real life protects or watches over, right? So that guardian consonant's job is to protect that short vowel or prove it short. That phonetic skill 1 is one guardian consonant, makes the vowel short. So I'm not going to go through all of these in the same depth for time's sake today, but you get that process of coming up and around and proving that. Phonetic skill 2 words, which is what those students we're going to get to a little bit later. They're just doing that phonetic skill 1, but they haven't been able to even come on top. And now they can come on top and prove that, even this time with 2 guardian consonants, also prove our vowel short. Phonetic skill 3 is this time when we've got no guardian consonants following the vowel stands alone, it will be long. That's our most common syllable type. In fact, in those first 3 phonetic skills, that covers 75% of our syllable types from a frequency percentage. So super easy to transfer that. Phonetic skill 4 is our silent E rule. When E is at the end and there's a previous vowel, which I've identified already, that E will be silent. So I come up around, cross through not only that vowel E, but the X beneath it, because I'm still able to count my X's to know how many syllables that word is. And that silent E's job, though, when I stay on that road, is to make that previous vowel long. My vowel is long because the word ends in silent E. And the 5th and final phonetic skill is when 2 vowels are adjacent or right next to each other. There's 9 specific vowel teams. When they're right next to each other, this is the most common pronunciation, where the second vowel is silent, and that is what proves or makes the first vowel long. Those are explicitly taught. But this framework of the core 5 phonetic skills, using this spatial process to prove, actually supports executive function and working memory, which is such a critical factor for our children who struggle. Part of the diagnosis of dyslexia and ADD and ADHD is an executive function deficiency. So let's talk just for a second about what executive function is. Executive function is basically the management system of the brain. It helps guide thought and behavior. It deals with attention, initiative, inhibition, flexibility, planning, time management, also emotional control, so that emotional regulation. So these are all things that all of these things I was seeing in my son, and I had no idea that was connected to his reading difficulty. And so it's happening at the same time. That executive function, it's why they can't, they struggle with knowing what to give priority to in a word, but then there's all these other factors because of the executive function difficulties that are showing up in behavior. 3 main functions of executive function are this: working memory, the ability, cognitive flexibility, and inhibitory control. The main one I'm just going to talk about today is working memory. So working memory, having to remember a list of steps, that's why that spatial process to prove in instruction becomes invaluable, because they can't remember a list of steps that they need to do, especially sequentially. So what's interesting is my son could not tie his shoes until 5th grade. He wore slip-on or Velcro because it's a multi-step sequential process he had to hold in working memory. Couldn't do it. So his ability to tie his shoes was tied to this. And that was such a light bulb moment for me. And I couldn't say to him, Tyler, go upstairs and make your bed and pick up your toys and hang up your clothes. I'd get deer in headlights. I gave him too many things to hold in his memory to have to keep in sequence to go up and complete. I'd go up, downstairs and find him playing Legos in his room, or he'd get really emotional because he was so frustrated by it. Understanding the executive function, and there's some books that we'll share after too that we can share out. There's one that was really helpful for me on executive function. I quit giving him multi-step directions. Things like that that were a game changer in our home, that I didn't understand what was happening because I didn't understand this piece of it. That can be really helpful in some of the behavior issues that we were having. So strategies to support working memory. So compensatory strategies like making sure that we're explicit in the instruction, doing one step at a time, and giving that scaffold support, like giving them a visual of what we want them to do if they've got jobs or we want those steps to be in reading. Doing some help with recall strategies, having them say it back, talk through the process is helpful, and then giving them resources about those steps that they need to take as well, and some external aids like those visual cues and prompts. All of those things can be really helpful. We need to support working memory because we know that is an issue for our children who struggle with reading. So this is the last piece of the element that I'll show you, and then we're going to wrap up on a couple of things. The 2 decoding skills, how this applies to syllabication. Being able to simplify with those 5 phonetic skills, then they can apply these patterns. So we're dropping that perceived difficulty for them, which is really important for their confidence to be able to feel like they can handle it. So we're going to take those 5 skills, break down the word motel, and apply that to prove it. So if it was M-O, we'd read that mo, because that vowel stands alone. Once we add that T, that would be a guardian, which would make our vowel short, we'd read that mot. When we add the E, that E would be silent because it's the end, so we'd read that moat. Now once we add the L, what do? We're out of the framework of the 5 phonetic skills, right? Well, first of all, I can clearly see it's a 2-syllable word because I've got those 2 X's. So rather than coming up and around the end of the whole word, we're going to do that per syllable. And there's only 2 decoding skills, just 2, to tell us where to divide any word of any length. We're going to come back to that first vowel and look at what's immediately following it. Look at how many consonants you see immediately following that vowel. You can type it in the chat. How many consonants between our working vowels? Just 1. And when there's 1, we apply decoding skill 1, which says that one consonant must go on with the next syllable. So we're going to divide in front of that 1. Now, once we divide, here's what's so cool. Those syllables will be one of our 5 phonetic skills. Just look at what's in the box. That vowel stands alone, it will be long. We've got that guardian consonant in that second syllable, proving that short, and the word is motel. It's why they learn concepts early on like those blends, because they're going to move together. If it's arced, it's going to move together, so I divide in front of it, and then I'm still able to prove that correctly with those 5 skills. Last of the 2 decoding skills. This time, how many consonants do you see in between the working vowels? How many? 2, and it's not a blend or digraph. That's why they need to know that. So those 2 consonants, we apply decoding skill 2, super easy. 2 will split, so I divide between it. Now that first syllable has that guardian making that vowel short, exact same pattern in the second syllable, and the word is campus. That's it. 1 consonant will go on, 2 will split, works for any word of any length. The only reason we ever have more than 2 consonants in between is there will be a blend or a digraph, like in the word extreme, so we divide between that consonant and the blend, and then we're able to prove that correctly. So no longer is the length of the word an issue. Our children can decode multisyllabic words without a problem. It's about presenting it in a simple way, giving them successful experiences to build that confidence, and using our instruction in that systematic approach, but addressing working memory and executive function, all those things that can be difficult for students. To address the whole individual, this is critical. The research coming out of University of California, San Francisco, is a couple of things that are really important. So we know the whole brain approach. We know that brain networks are in balance with each other. So they've got these cognitive strengths that are, you know, on the other side of some of these weaknesses or difficulties. So we know the executive function difficulty. We actually know the language deficits in the left hemisphere actually increase the emotional systems on the right side of the brain. So what's so interesting is they will have heightened emotions, but because of the executive function, a lack of ability to control those. So these are our children who are more prone to anxiety, to depression, and a lot of research is coming out of there about approaches to help them, like cognitive behavior therapy, dialectical behavior therapy, learning how to manage our thoughts and emotions. That is critical. So often they go into fight or flight. I love Grace LeConte's work. She does mostly with businesses, but she talks about how, you know, we've heard of fight, flight, or freeze. So our students, you can think about our children, you know, if they get frustrated, they get into that fear and anxiety, they want to fight back. They're the behavior problems, or they just run away. Or when they can't, they feel like they have no control over either of those, it's when we go to the third option and we freeze and we just shut down, which is largely that shut down learner. But there's a fourth option, to face that fear. The only way we can do that is if we have the confidence that we have the capacity to do that. So it's about arming our children with strategies in not only reading, but in how to control or to navigate their thoughts, to deal with their emotions that are heightened. Again, cognitive behavioral therapy, dialectical behavior therapy, those are highly recommended in helping our children face that. Because what can happen is when they can experience failure over and over again, Martin Seligman, brilliant psychologist, talked about the 3 P's of pessimism, where we get that learned helplessness over failure over time, where we think we do 3 things: personalize it, we go into the pervasiveness and permanence. It's my fault, my whole life is awful, it's always going to be awful. My reading difficulties are my fault, and it makes my whole life terrible, and it's always going to be terrible. And so we can see why they get so resistant to help. And again, one of the best ways to help move out of this kind of explanatory style of pessimism, of viewing things that way, is to shift the belief first that it's not tied to their intelligence or ability, that everything is possible to them. And that largely comes from recognizing the difference between a fixed and a growth mindset. You nailed it at the first. So fixed mindset. If I have to work at something, that's bad. I'm not good at it. No effort means, because we see people that it's so easy for, well, then that must be the way to go, right? So we hide our struggles and challenges. If it doesn't come easy, then don't do it. But we want to go into that growth mindset where effort plus ability is success, that we can develop our abilities, and that challenges are an opportunity to grow, and we can handle it. And one of the best ways that we can give that to our children is modeling it for them. Not hide our struggles, model for them how to work through it, and that this is an opportunity to learn, and that we can grow, that that's possible, and to give them those tools to be able to do, to build that confidence to move forward. So creating a growth mindset for our children. Acknowledge that fixed mindsets exist, raise awareness about the difference between fixed and growth, normalize struggles, normalize them, give them time to work through things, set a culture that values taking risks. It's okay if we fail, it's how we learn, no big deal, we don't have to be perfect. Teach individuals to articulate their thinking. So what are you thinking? What are you processing? Encourage them deliberately. Encourage the effort, not the outcome. Encourage and praise the effort, always, always, and harness the power of yet. So I'm not good at reading. You're not good at reading yet. I'm not good at organization. Not good at organization yet. That anything is possible. This is a big game changer in helping our children be successful. So I know I'm at time. I want to share really quickly, if it's okay, just this last piece about what Tyler talked about, and then we'll take 1 minute to share resources coming up for you. But this, I wanted him to end it today in sharing one of the most valuable things that we should all know.
The best thing about dyslexia is that with the 5 senses, when you're missing one, it heightens other ones. So since I'm missing kind of my English kind of section of my brain, it heightens other stuff like science and math. And I do excel in those classes, and I just love those classes. And I just love doing scientific things like inventing stuff, programming stuff. What I would tell someone else with dyslexia is that they're not stupid and they can do it. And you just gotta think of your own way to take in information and stuff. And sometimes maybe my stuff will help them, maybe not. Maybe their stuff will help me, maybe not. But just that they're for sure not stupid. They're actually probably smarter than some kids in some subjects. Everyone's smarter than someone in a different way.
I love that everybody's smarter than someone in a different way. We all have our strengths, and to access that and know that's possible becomes invaluable. I know there was a question, and I want to come back to that. Let me share these resources, and then raise your hand again, and we'll come back and answer that. You can access the free online workshop where you can learn more about these skills and how to teach this structured literacy approach to help your child. And we'll share all the contact information to find out more about that. We also have a free dyslexia screener, where it's a screener to look at specifically if there's those characteristics, so you can decide how to move forward to get additional testing, but also go down that road about providing that specific instruction. We do have the software that's for that home use, where you can have the software for ages 4 to 9 or ages 10 to adult, where it will diagnose what skills are missing on those critical decoding skills and provide that very personalized instruction and application to help your child be successful. We also have articles available, one specifically on reading strategies for parents, part 1. We're going to have more of those, understanding that reading pyramid, what we should be teaching. Again, one of the missions to be able to connect the science to what we're doing with our children at home too. And we're going to get more into that in upcoming webinars, specifically the next one on August 19th. Will be resources to help your struggling reader succeed. So you'll even learn more about the resources in depth. I just wanted to highlight those coming up for you. So here's the contact information for RISE Institute for Literacy, the website where you can email, and the phone number. I apologize for going a little bit long. This is something I could talk about for hours. So thank you for sticking with us today and letting me share that. And I know we're at time, so if you need to go, feel free to go, but I'm happy to stay on and answer questions as long as you want. So I'll turn it back to you, Pat, and then anybody put questions in the chat, or you can raise your hand again and we can answer those.
Okay. Thank you so much, Chantel. That was wonderful. Thanks for being with us today. And we want to thank our staff who have made sure that everything ran smoothly today as well. We have Praful Gowda, Claudia Demardant, and Amber Fiegelson, who have been in the background making sure that everything went smoothly. And thank you most of all to all of you for participating and being part of this and joining us for this webinar. And our hope is that each one of you will take with you some ideas and solutions that will help and be valuable in you working with your readers. Again, I'll just reiterate that watch for an email coming with information for the follow-up webinar, and that follow-up webinar will really focus on additional resources that you can engage in your reading journey. And I'm going to turn it back to you and let you close up, Chantel, if there's any questions that you want to answer before we drop off.
Thank you, Pat. Yeah, if there's any questions, you could raise your hand again. I know, sorry, I was kind of finishing up, so we didn't answer your raised hand. If you want to raise it again, we can open that up, or you can drop. Okay, we've got two that have raised their hand. Praful, do you want to, or whoever's going to let them speak?
I just read it. Can you hear me? This is Jim.
Yes.
This is Jim O'Connor. My wife is here too, and we really appreciate your seminar. We've been through the Reading Horizon training. We went through the training in December of 2018, and we spent about 5 months teaching a group of 15 junior high and high school refugee children how to read, and it was really great. It's fabulous material. We love the material. Now, my wife has this 10-year-old boy, refugee boy, that she's teaching now, and he's a Swahili speaker, so he doesn't, he didn't grow up with English. He's been in America 2 years. His verbal literacy is very good, but he can't read anything, and he's still just having a really hard time with the vowel sounds. And we've noticed this before. We've been ESL teachers for like 9 years, so we've noticed this before in teaching ESL, that the short vowel sounds are just really, really hard. And he just doesn't seem to get them. My wife's meeting with him twice a week and going over this stuff, and at the beginning, he can't remember anything. At the end, he still, he's starting to get it, but then the next time she meets with him, he doesn't remember anything. I'm just wondering if you have comments.
Oh, you kind of cut out there a little bit at the end, Jim. There definitely is that language issue where it could just be a disconnect. It sounds like, though, interestingly enough, with the inability to hold that, to move that to short-term memory, that this child could have some processing issues. Dyslexia is not a respecter of a particular person or race or gender, or, and so, he could have a processing issue too as to why it's not sticking. And so the repeated practice, more visuals, as much kinesthetic motion as possible, attaching a visual to it. Those kinesthetic cues are so critical for EL students. So if you're not aware of those kinesthetic cues, we can send you that for that.
Yeah, no, we know those. We've done that.
Yeah, other than that, it's just the repeated practice. We can reach out to a couple of EL specialists that we have here that might have something a little bit more for you. But I know I work with them continually, and they continually tell me that what an EL students need is what a struggling reader needs, and that there's not anything necessarily magic that they do differently. But the visuals, the kinesthetic, recording themselves, playing it back, and hearing that. But my suspicion is the way that you're saying, because that's very indicative of someone with a processing issue, that they don't know anything at the beginning of the session, but they've got it by the end, but then it's gone by the next session. Yeah. Because of the memory issue, my guess is you've also got either dyslexia or something like that going on, which is why he's having such difficulty.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Hey, Chantel, quick question. And I'm not sure if this would be valid or not, but is the program that Heidi's working with that's kind of more pre-literacy, would there be some of that might be helpful for this as well?
Yeah, sure. I know that we're coming out with more specific EL approaches for that pre-literacy, and yes, as those come out, those can be things that we can share with you too, Jim. I just don't know where those were at in release, but we can share that as well. And Heidi and Carrie are two that come to mind, that ones that we could refer you to, and maybe Amber, Claudia, Pat, we could connect them, Jim and his wife with them, to maybe ask a couple of questions, because that's not my specialty is EL, and so maybe just see if there's something else that they could offer to help with there.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Amber, would you be able to get his maybe his email if you don't have it, and then connect with him via email maybe?
Yes, we can take care of that.
Okay, thanks.
Great. Any other questions that we can answer today? A couple more. Raise their hand. And just unmute yourself, maybe. Looks like Amber put in, maybe you can just unmute yourself. And we might need to him still unmute.
Yeah, Claudia or Amber, could you or Profil unmute Margarita Burke?
Well, we're looking into it right now.
Okay, thanks. Good. It looks like Margarita is unmuted.
Yes. Hello, this is Margarita.
Hi.
Hi. Excellent presentation. I have a quick question. My son is in public school. We're in New York, and he is a struggling reader. We've been working with him. We tried the Reading Horizon program, but it did not take. But so we tried something else that didn't work either. But I wanted to know, like, how could we get some program like that? Because the teachers are not really receptive. That I found at his school. They have this standard approach, and they're not willing at all to, with learning the phonics and everything like that. They're just, unwilling actually. So how would you be able to, like, any suggestions on how we can move forward, especially with the new blended learning situation, on getting a program like Reading Horizons into, because, New York, educational is a little different. It's by district, but it's also by, it's a little different than other places.
Yeah, and we've done work there too. Yeah, so if it didn't take, a lot of times I would ask how it was actually taught, because if it's not taught well, if there's not the multisensory piece brought in, if there's a few, that's usually the issue as to why it didn't take, or if there's not a lot of transfer. And so my recommendation would be, yes, you can absolutely get the software for at home, but you going through and knowing how to teach it so that you can provide some of that multi-sensory piece and questions and answers would be valuable. And we could talk, you'll find some more resources too about tutoring and things that we're offering through RISE, and that's something they'll talk about more on the 19th, but you can also email at the RISE Institute to find out a little bit more about those resources, but those are all going to be available to you at home.
Right, because I think it was the fact that he when it comes to working independently, we're still struggling with that. And so with the software, it was, a one-on-one. And so I thought if it was in like a classroom setting or like a tutor setting, it would be, because we're using more than one sentence, so it would be excellent for him. And so that was why I was also interested in the program.
Yeah, definitely. We're going to be talking more about those services coming up. So.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Other questions? We've had a couple other raised hands.
It looks like Rebecca Reinhard.
Yes, hi. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, hi. I have a 16-year-old son. I actually have two sons. The other's 13. But we've been homeschooling from the get-go. And I kind of took a more let him learn at his own pace approach, not pressuring him a lot and so on. But it's become apparent that he's got an issue that it would have to be dyslexia. I mean, his working memory, he'll remember something one day and then the next day it's like it's gone. And that applies to math, facts, as well as reading.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know if that's a typical thing, but my concern at this point obviously is trying to get him caught up. So if we did this program realistically, what kind of a timeline are we looking at as far as, do you work with them like an hour a day, 5 days a week? And can you elaborate on that a bit?
You bet. The recommended is about 30 to 45 minutes, a minimum of 4 times a week. So It's intensive enough that sometimes there's a diminished point of return after about 40, 45 minutes.
Yes.
So, or even breaking that up into 20-minute sessions, that's possible too.
Okay.
Utilizing that gradual release, that's going to be important as well. But so you're looking, it takes about 40 to 60 hours to complete the full program in those upper grades for individuals. And so that'll kind of give you an idea about how long if you're spending about 30 to 45 minutes a day. And they can take a couple days on a concept or on a lesson. And so it may take a little bit of time to get through that. But you should be able to see that's the thing too, is we don't want them to go so slow. It's this fine line between going too fast or too slow, in that Goldilocks, that space. And so this will help guide that pacing. And we can help talk to you about that, but keeping that momentum going, utilizing both the online piece and then some instruction will be really helpful. But about 30 to 45 minutes max a day, about 4 times a week. If you can, you'll see pretty consistent results.
So you're basically, what you're doing is kind of starting them at, I don't want to say rock bottom, but at the most basic level, which would be the phonemic awareness, and making sure they get it, and then build on that. So you're kind of going to square one. Is that my understanding? Like really their age really isn't relevant.
Right. So the age is only relevant as far as maturity of interface of the material, and age is relevant.
Okay. Yeah, you don't want to look childish for a 16-year-old.
That's really why we have the 2 approaches for that.
Yes.
You're alone. So, and with those older students, we do know that usually their letter sound knowledge is there. So what we do is we just normally, rather than just going into chapter 1, we assess their phonemic awareness, we assess their letter sound knowledge, and then go based on that.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Good. Other questions? Okay, another one. You're welcome. You are welcome, Naomi. Let's see what else here. Okay. Okay, well, if there are additional questions, you have the email here. I'm happy to coordinate with Rise and answer anything that maybe would be specific to something you wanted to know from what I shared today. Just thank you again for your time. I'll turn it back to you, Pat.
Good. Thank you so much for joining. And again, thank you, Chantel, for your time today. That was fantastic. And with that, we'll say goodbye and hope you have a great remainder of your day. Thank you.
Bye, everybody. Stay well.